Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is the Helix Center Roundtable. The date today is February 26, 2022, and I'm pleased to present to you our esteemed panel for today. I'll make a few brief comments first. I'm Jerry Hurwitz. I'm the Associate Director at Helix Center, and we're continuing this Zoom and YouTube format for the meantime, and we're not sure about our next. I think we're going to be in Zoom next time also, and that date for our next talk is March 12th. Yeah, sorry.
I think September, October would be when we would be live, would be in person.
Good. So March 12th will be our next roundtable, and the topic there will be psychedelics. It might not matter to you whether it's March 12th if you're taking psychedelics, but anyway, that's the date of it. And it should be really interesting talk. And we are targeting April 30th as the date for our last talk of the spring season, which will be on metaphysics. Today, we are pleased to be presenting a panel with the main theme of economics in the present and the near future. But we have some non-economists and economists, and I'd like to take a moment now and describe to you some of their bios. So first, Nicholas Economides is a professor of economics at the Stern School of Business at NYU and founder and executive director of the NET Institute. He has taught previously at Columbia University, Stanford, and University of California, Berkeley. He is an internationally recognized academic authority on network economics, antitrust, and public policy. His fields of specialization and research include antitrust, the economics of platforms and networks, telecommunications and the internet, computers and information, the economics of technical compatibility and standardization of industrial organization. He is advised or is currently advising the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the governments of Canada, Greece, Ireland, New Zealand, and Portugal. That's Nicholas Economides. Jennifer Jacquet is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and director of XE, Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement at NYU. She is also deputy director of NYU's Center for Environmental and Animal Protection and affiliated faculty in the Stern School of Business and the Center for Data Science. Her research focuses on animals in the environment, agnotology, and attribution and responsibility in the Anthropocene. She also is the author of Is Shame Necessary? About the evolution, function, and future of the use of social disapproval in a globalized, digitized world, and of The Playbook, How to Deny Science, Sell Lies, and Make a Killing in the Corporate World, another book which is forthcoming in June of this year. A work of epistolary nonfiction that makes the business case for scientific denial. She is the recipient of the 2015 Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship and a 2016 Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation. Next is David W. Schwartzman, professor emeritus at Howard University in geochemistry. It has a PhD from geochemistry from Brown University. In 1999, he published Life, Temperature, and the Earth, in addition to many papers in Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, and other journals. His most recent books are The Earth is Not for Sale, and his older son Peter and the Global Solar Commons from 2021. David serves on the advisory board of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, and the editorial board of Science and Society. He's an active member of the DC statehood Green Party of the United States. Robert H. Frank is the H.J. Lewis Professor of Management and Professor of Economics Emeritus at Cornell's Johnson School of Management. His Economic View column, that's the name of it, has appeared in the New York Times since 2005. He received his BS in mathematics from Georgia Tech, then taught math and science for 2 years at the Peace Corps volunteers in rural Nepal. He holds an MA in statistics and a PhD in economics, both from the University of California at Berkeley. His books, which include Choosing the Right Pond, Passions Within Reason, Microeconomics and Behavior, Principles of Economics, with Ben Bernanke, Luxury Fever, What Price the Moral High Ground, and several others. The New York Times, and it was, forgive me, yeah. The Winner Take All Society, which was co-authored with Philip Cook, received the Critics' Choice Award and was named Notable Book of the Year by the New York Times and was included in Business Week's list of the 10 best books of 1995. And Richard Howarth is an environmental and ecological economist who studied the interplay between economic analysis and the ecological, moral, and social dimensions of environmental governance. His topical interests focus on the valuation and management of ecosystem services, theories of discounting and intergenerational justice, climate stabilization policy, the ethical foundation of voluntary pro-environmental behaviors, and the relationship between economic growth, environmental quality, and human well-being is mediated by endogenous social norms. Professor Howarth graduated summa cum laude from the Biology and Society program at Cornell University and holds an MS in land resources from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his PhD from the Energy and Resource Group at the University of California at Berkeley in 1990, where he collaborated with Richard B. Norgaard on the economics of natural resources and sustainable development. So that's a short as I could make it, introduction to our esteemed panel. I wanted to just start off by quoting Charles Kindleberger, the economics historian, who mentioned just very tersely that how history is particular and economics is general. And I mentioned to some of our panelists in advance of our talk how much I found it interesting that economics is being pressed into dealing with a lot of rapid change and instability in the world, which we're facing now, which includes, of course, climate change, mass migrations, supply chain disruptions, et cetera, et cetera. Now we know, of course, of this dreadful tragedy going on in the Ukraine, which is going to almost certainly impact all of these different domains. So I want to open the floor to whoever wants to take a quick stab at introducing the conversation and getting it rolling, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, if I may, I think that the present reality after the invasion of Ukraine reminds us that we should be more humble in terms of making predictions. I mean, we are talking about the long run. I thought that's what was our topic today. And unfortunately, even in the short run, we see instability we didn't anticipate. So from my point of view, that means that it's crucial to think of what really works in human behavior, what economists think really works. And think of that, and which is going to remain there no matter what happens in world politics and world affairs. And I would underline the issue of incentives, that incentives work. People being paid more are going to work harder. The lower taxation on investment can make a huge difference to drive economic growth. And the crucial aspect of education, that education, persistent excellence in education has driven innovation in the United States and other countries of the world where education was underlined. And as an academic, I have to express my concerns for the cheapening of education, making exams easier, allowing people to perform well when they're not performing well, showing them as if they're performing well. So these are kind of the long run issues that come up to mind as we think of what might survive the upheaval that we're seeing in the world these days. So let me start from there and let other people have a chance to say more. Thank you.
I don't want to preempt the women on the panel. Generally in Zooms, I respect that. I don't know if I'm the oldest one here, probably not. But nevertheless, I'll say a few things to try to provoke the conversation because I think I'm probably the most left-wing person on the panel. And so I'll try to live up to that. My motto is be as radical as reality itself. And taking radical as a good thing, going to the root. So let me read a quick quotation from my latest book, The Global Solar Commons. This is from the financial editorial board of the Financial Times, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And it said, radical reforms are required to forge a society that will work for all. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. They must see public services as investments rather than liabilities and look for ways to make labor markets less insecure. Redistribution will again be on the agenda. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. So again, I come from a physical natural science background. That's my expertise. I'm not an economist, but I am most concerned on how the physical economy will need to be developed that is compatible with preventing catastrophic climate change and protecting biodiversity. And that, again, has really deep implications to the political economy, which as an eco-socialist, I find fossil capitalism to be obsolete and a profound barrier to preventing catastrophic climate change. So I'll conclude by saying, again, as a provocation, that a militarized fossil capital that we now see in play with this war that's going on is the main obstacle to forging a world where you have cooperation necessary to prevent climate catastrophe. So I hope that's not too provocative. I hope it's more provocative. Thank you.
It's perfectly provocative. Anyone want to take a response to that? I was going to say that I think you're trying to combine some of these first two comments. I'm on the one side talking about being as radical as the world is, on the other side, sort of reinforcing our interest in competence, education and competence. It was interesting to note the performance of the CDC in the face of the pandemic. And of course, it did have also economic implications that were quite strong and not something the CDC probably normally welcomes as a challenge. But here you had an institution that was really felt to be rather competent. And by some folks' reckoning, it struggled a lot anyway. And I think in part it struggled because of the rapidity of onset of the particular stresses we were facing. So I wonder if people want to comment on that at all.
May I comment on the previous speaker's ideas? I think that it's very, very important to keep in place incentives for investment and growth. And I think that people who want redistribution have to take that into consideration. The idea that suddenly there is this gold mine there in which we can all tap and redistribute to the poor without taking into account what effect this will have on investment and growth is just foolish. I'm sorry, it could be a great radical idea, but it's just foolish. I mean, we need to be able to invest in growth, and that works through incentives. And incentives of the government provides tax incentives for growth. So we shouldn't really eliminate them, and that's serious. I mean, it's not trivial to just put it under the carpet. no matter what kind of other objectives we have to make sure that this happens. And in particular, the United States is facing a huge challenge, not from Russia, but from China on this issue. China is about to overtake the United States economically in a few years. If we focus on redistribution without thinking of investment and growth, this will happen very quickly, the overtaking of the United States by China. And being second or being third is really not good. People haven't lived it in our lifetime. The United States was always first, and therefore the issue didn't really come up. But if we are second or third in the next 5 or 10 years, that will hurt us. And that's very, very important. So without putting down in any way David's radicals ideas, I think it's very important. I think it's very important to keep the investment incentives and the excellence in education investment, especially investment in education, especially for the top institutions, the top academic institutions, because this has driven innovation with all kinds of positive effects, externalities in the United States.
Let me just very briefly respond, and then I'll be quiet for quite a while, if you don't mind. I agree with you, Nicholas. We do need incentives. Right now, the incentives, the IMF estimates that the subsidies to fossil fuel, direct and indirect, total nearly $6 trillion a year. That's certainly an incentive, powerful incentive for the continuation of the burning of fossil fuel globally. And so those incentives should be shifted to green capital. Absolutely. We need green growth, not to say that green capital doesn't have its own problems, but certainly in terms of curbing fossil fuel consumption as fast as possible, which is necessary for any chance of meeting 1.5 degree warming limit, we need to promote green capital, defeat fossil capital, and form a global alliance with green capital. So I agree with you. There are incentives that are necessary. We probably agree more than you think. And I'll be quiet now.
I'll jump in and I'll say that from this angle, I see a set of intersecting, interlocking global crises that all are linked to the history of the last 30 years in globalization 1.0. And we deregulated financial markets. We decided not to move away from oil and gas in the United States. At least we decided that. In Europe, the approach to Russia was about market liberalization, the idea that interdependence would turn Russia into a liberal democracy. And just on that last, and then Germany in particular in Europe became very dependent on natural gas for reasons that are complex. But in some ways, you could ask whether that focus on market liberalization, is that boomeranged back in ways that have contributed to the current crisis in Ukraine? I'm not sure that that's right, but that's a question that's on my mind that I'll put out there.
Yeah, can I add a little bit on incentives as well? Of course, incentives are important. The reason we're in the mess we're in right now is precisely because we've been sending people the wrong incentives. You discharge CO2 into the air, that has costs on everybody. Nobody pays an extra fee for the right to do that. We could do it without charge now. We never should have allowed that incentive to remain in place. We need to make massive public investment now in order to achieve climate stability, and there's very little time left to meet the objective of avoiding temperature increases greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which read David Wallace Wells's book if you haven't. There are grim fates in store for us in every country if we let temperatures rise more than that. So we've got to act quickly. And I think the investments we need to make, many of them can come in the private sector. We can guide them with, as we have in the past, with subsidies for renewable energy investments and the like. There is now a very exciting new technology developed by Climeworks in Switzerland to suck carbon out of the air and turn it into a carbon-based slurry that you pump deep underground. And it's very expensive now, but we're on a track to have the cost of that come down rapidly enough to where it too could make a difference. But all this is going to require an enormous amount of money. We've got an enormous amount of money. That's not the problem. The problem is to persuade people to part with what they're using the money for now and to use it instead for these other things that if we don't use it for them, there's not going to be a future for us. And so I think that means if you want to be practical, looking to the top of the income pyramid, there's enormous resources there. We've been hearing about wealth taxes and how small the bite they need to take in order to generate enormous pools of resources to invest in these public projects that need to happen. I'm not worried about people lacking incentives to grow wealthy if they have to pay a little bit more in tax. There's a huge literature on the determinants of human flourishing. It's contentious. People argue about many of the findings in it. The one thing they don't argue about, the one really secure finding that's held up in every study, is that beyond a certain point, and it's one we've long since passed, and most countries in the West have too, further increases in consumption serve only to raise the bar that we think of as adequate. So if all the mansions get 10% bigger, the people living in them aren't any happier, any healthier than they were before. If the cars get bigger, people aren't only not happier, they're at more at risk of death and injury. We burn up more fossil fuels. All of these things could be changed if we changed people's incentives, and we've got simple tax levers that can do that. So yes, incentives are important, and we've been steering people with the wrong incentives thus far. That's why we're in the mess that we're in.
I guess I should jump in to just ask, a kind of meta question about economics or the field of economics, which is something I grapple with, is how much is the field of economics itself responsible for those misaligned incentives? And so I'm one of the people here who did major in economics as an undergrad, then a master's in economics, and realized I did not want to get a PhD in economics. I know, Rich, you and Bob have survived the field, and I'm sort of curious, when Nicholas says, like, what really works, how much should we look to economists for what really works? I feel like we've been gravely misled by some of the assumptions and ideologies of the field, and also some serious levers for human behavior have been overlooked, including reputation, of course, and reputation being the primary mechanism to enforce the Paris Agreement. And it's something economists don't, I think, address very well. And I've been very disturbed more recently by the fact that, the student divestment movement around fossil fuels, the pushback within academia has come primarily from economics professors. And this strikes me again as an area of tension where we have this kind of hubris about what really works. In an era of mass unpredictability and a kind of lack of humility, I would say, on the part of economists in general, not, of course, specifically to anyone in this roundtable, but about asking what really works. When psychologists start winning the Nobel Prize in economics, you should start doubting, the tenets of your discipline.
Well, I think that it would be. I mean, if we're going to be serious about it, you cannot attack a field of study. I mean, seriously. I mean, that would be just dumb. I mean, there is diversity among people people have used the same quantitative tools with different assumptions and draw different conclusions. That's the way I see economics. People who do that in physics or in psychology or in other fields. It's a science. Not everybody agrees. But I think practically everybody agrees that incentives work. And I think that Robert's ideas about how to change incentives are, in my opinion, very important. And society as a whole has to think seriously what possibilities there are there. I think there is a conflict between trying to take away the wealth of whoever is the wealthy individual, Bezos or whoever that is, and trying to create the right incentives, even for the objectives that you are talking about of green growth, for example. I mean, there could be a lot of different ways to achieve that green growth without screwing up the incentives of the society for investment. Because after all, when we're talking about wealthy individuals with multi-billion-dollar wealth, when we take away, let's say, $1 billion or $10 billion from them, we're not changing consumption, because these people cannot possibly consume that amount of money. We're taking it away from investment. So that we have to be, truthful about it. We're taking it away from investment. So the real question is the government good in doing investments? And everybody knows that it's not true. That's not true. The government, if you give it $10 billion, it's going to be wasted to a very large extent. And we all agree on that. So we have to think of ways in which the incentives are set up so that the private sector produces what we want, the green growth that we all agree we want. So we need to think of that. And this is a serious issue. I mean, it's not trivial, and we need to work on it. I mean, how can I put it? I mean, just general declarations. Let's take the photo that Bezos has. I mean, that will not get us anywhere. We need to think of incentives for the private sector to invest in these areas that we're interested to invest. Thank you.
In Luxury Fever, that was in 1999 that the book came out, and you had the graduated consumption tax. And that's a really good idea, because we live in a society that, as Galbraith said back in the 50s, is characterized by what? Private splendor and public squalor. And we're arguably, because of status externalities and positional goods, we've constructed a society where we have excessive levels of private consumption, and we underinvest in public goods and in public infrastructure. And I think I'd agree with Robert Frank that many of the investments that now are most important, the public sector has to be in the lead on that, and it has to be done at a global level. And so what works, I think, is something that looks more like social democracy than like laissez-faire capitalism. And maybe we need to look back at what worked in the New Deal era in the 50s and 60s. There are some problems there, but maybe we need to go back towards a better balance between the public and private sector. And it should be incentive-based, and it should be investment-focused.
Nick, you said we all agree that when government invests, they do a bad job of it. I don't think we all agree about that. At least I don't agree with it. They do a bad job in some cases, but in other cases, there are investments that the private sector simply doesn't have any incentive to make, so that even if the government did a poor job with them, it would be better than not seeing them happen at all. But there are plenty of examples where the government's done a splendidly good job with public investment. I mean, there are massive public works programs all over the world that do an enormous amount of good for the citizens of their countries. Why do we insist that the government's not any good at things like that?
If I may, I mean, I would say that the reason why the government might not be as good as you think on that is because the government is run by politicians, and politicians need to be re-elected. So on top of their minds is how they're going to please the public when they get re-elected. And one way to please the public is to take this money that they have under their control and dole it out, give it to the public rather than invest it. Even though you're absolutely right, Robert, that investing it in some public goods is in fact an excellent idea. There are of course aspects of the economy where the incentives for the private sector are not big enough. I mean, that's for sure. But the problem is that there is a conflict at the government level, because we're human beings. We're run by politicians whose top priority is to get reelected, and there is no doubt about that. The top priority is not to make the United States great. Their top priority is to get reelected, and to do that, they're going to distribute the money to the voters, and that problem is going to be there no matter what government we have. As long as we have an elected government, it's going to be there. And therefore, we need to take it into account and say, well, do we really want to give huge amounts of money from the private sector to the public sector, or we know it has less productivity? Do we need to do that, except for a very essential stuff like national defense, for example, in which we don't want to give it to the private sector? So it's important to think about it and not jump to conclusions and say, oh yeah, great. I mean, that just because the government is doing some good job in some investments, let's give them a huge project, which is the green project, to them, but rather try to find ways to do it in the private sector.
And
Well,
government
I'd
is
just like
also,
to-
that. I would challenge that, Nicholas, because that analysis, because how do politicians get elected? Arguably, we now have less of a democracy and more of a plutocracy. And knowing the amount of money from the big corporate sector that goes into campaign funds. So that has distorted our democracy. And many people have pointed that out. So therefore, the politicians that are elected tend to serve the interests of their big campaign contributors. This is not rocket science.
Right.
I would add, in terms of what I would call trickle-down economics or neoliberal economics, which basically that's what I'm hearing from you. With all respect, I am. And let me give a case study from my community in DC. We have an elected city local government. Of course, we don't have statehood. We're fighting for it. And actually, the big prime instrument of fossil capital, Senator Manchin, is blocking that, among a few others, to actually have self-determination. But our own economic policies and social policies in our DC have been dominated by trickle-down economics. And what has this resulted in? DC now has the biggest life expectancy gap in the country compared to 50 states between Black and white residents. It actually has grown in the last 20 years. It's shockingly high. And this is a reflection of where the priorities of public spending and the fact that our politicians that are in power in our local government are basically beholden to the big developer class, which has gentrified DC, which has forced residents out, long-term residents. And so I'm going by our own experience in our local government, our local community, in terms of these impacts of these policies. And we also have seen in the pandemic how the billionaire class has grown even richer, and income inequality has grown. And finally, what does that mean to health? If we look at the life expectancy in the United States compared to its cohort of wealthy countries, we're ranked about 40 in the world. As a matter of fact, Cuba and the US have about the same life expectancy now.
I wonder if I think,
Yes.
I'm sorry, David. So Jennifer, I think
Yes.
you also had something to add at that point.
Well,
I'm gonna mute.
I would just say that, of course, you can attack an entire field. I mean, we have many times in the past. We attacked the field of eugenics. Right now, critical race theory is under attack. You can most certainly attack a whole field. And I think it's worth questioning, you know, especially the premise of this roundtable was about the sort of role of the dismal science of economics, which is not, of course, in fact, a science. Economics uses scientific tools, it uses empiricism. But if you know anything about the epistemology of science, terms like good and necessary growth or trickle down economics, these are all normative assumptions. They're all values that we bring. Rich, I see you nodding. I'm sure ecological economics has these kind of arguments all the time about the values that are baked into the research. And so I think what I'm interested in is the way in which, especially members of this panel, have grappled with some of those assumptions in the field of economics and are trying to modernize or make them relevant to the 21st century, make them less glaringly insufficient as they were, I think, in the 20th.
I mean, that's a good question. And I mean, I would also say that the democracy isn't working well in America. What is working well is the ability of corporations to get politicians elected who pursue corporate interests. And so we've been through 30 or 40 years of that. And we have an economy now that is built around rent capture and rent seeking. And a lot of what we call investment is about the financialization of the economy. But as our economy has become more financialized, then innovation has gone down, not up. And what we've seen then is a capture of wealth by capital at the expense of labor or workers, to use that term, because capital isn't an entity, capital is a factor of production. But what we have seen as an economy, because of the financialization and the emphasis on rent seeking and rent capture, we have an economy that is less fair, it's less productive. We're not able to solve some of the crucial problems that I mentioned earlier with globalization 1.0. So
that's in a way giving support to Nick's arguments about not wanting to give the government more resources because they're in the pocket of corporate interests. Of course, they're not going to spend the resources we give them in the public interest. I think it's important. That is a problem. I totally am quick to acknowledge that that's a serious problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. As we know from the surveys done every year by an organization headquartered in Berlin, it's called Transparency International. They interview people in countries all around the world. The kinds of questions they ask are of the sort, how do you feel about your government? Do you feel you get good value for your tax payments? Do you feel the people in charge of your government are honest in general, free of corruption? There are 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, depending on how you count, countries that end up at the top of that survey each and every year. The Scandinavian countries are there, New Zealand is there, Singapore, interestingly, is there. These citizens feel like, yes, our government's really delivering good value for the money we pay in taxes. The United States doesn't do very well in that survey. And I think really, if we maintain a narrative where government is evil and government is wasteful, it becomes harder to attract talented people to serve in government. Why would you want to be a bureaucrat if everybody thinks you're just wasting their money? You've got to work hard to build a good government. We had a woman elected here in Ithaca to be the Tompkins County Clerk. She happens to be in charge of the Department of Motor Vehicles, the favorite whipping boy of all government agencies. Oh, you don't want the whole government to be run like the DMV. Don't send them any money. She said, no, we're gonna turn this agency around. She had the staff trained. She got permission from Albany to streamline the payment system that they used. And now it's a pleasure to go to the DMV here. I sold a car recently. to a guy in Rochester. He said, "Oh, I'd come and pick it up there, but I don't have plates to drive." I said, "Come register it at our DMV." He said, "No, it's going to be an awful experience." No, he did it, and he walked away dumbfounded. He just couldn't believe what an easy and helpful experience he just had. So you want a good government, you have every reason to want one. You got to work at it.
I mentioned earlier the CDC in this context because I thought it was an interesting case study for an institution that had a high reputation to start with and ran into some troubles. I mean, it still gets, I think, fairly good grades, but it's been eroded to some degree. And the question is, obviously, competence is one important, maybe the most important factor in maintaining public faith in an institution, but there may be other issues to it play. And I wonder about incentivizing somehow the restitution of our belief in the system, because I think if you look at those other countries where people do think their government does good work, part of it is because their neighbors think their government does good work. And of course, the government may do good work, but the question is, there's sort of a groundswell of public opinion. How do we foster that? Because that's part of what makes our government work, I think. I think you'd all agree.
The CDC went downhill because it was in the service of Trump's agenda during his term. I mean, he had people in charge there who were doing his bidding, not the mission of the public health agency. That's improved markedly in the meantime, but still you can see they don't have a good sense of what's required of them as an agency. They recently postponed the approval of vaccines, COVID vaccines for kids under 5, demanding months of additional study. There were absolutely no red flags in the field showing that the vaccines were dangerous. There had been some indications that there was a very low incidence of myocarditis in teenage males from the vaccine. They weren't even sure that that was true, but in no instance was anybody hospitalized on that account. Nobody died of it, certainly. And they made kids under 5 ineligible for the vaccines for more than a half a year longer than necessary, just out of some odd desire not to be criticized if anything possibly could have gone wrong. Well, we know things are going to go wrong if you don't approve it, because kids were getting the virus and dying from it.
And we also know that after SARS in 2004, I think it was, the global health community pointed out that it wasn't a question of whether, but when there would be a major pandemic. I recall Gro Harlem Brundtland giving a talk at Dartmouth, I think maybe in 2009, when she was running the World Health Organization. And she made the case that the global community was woefully underprepared for what needed to be done to prevent an event like we are now living through it. I mean, she turned out to be right about that. If you read the scientific journals, then people in epidemiology and public health have been making that argument for a long time. There's been some successes, like controlling Ebola in Africa. And part of this is also about the nexus between the environment and people's livelihoods. And pandemic risks have a lot to do with how agriculture and resource extraction is carried out in biodiversity hotspots where people are poor and don't necessarily have viable livelihood opportunities. And solving a problem like that, heading off the next pandemic, requires global institutions that point in the direction of sustainable development instead of more wars and more financial market crashes.
I would add to that, I just looked up the death rates by country of COVID at the Johns Hopkins website today. The death rate, that is by population. The US, the ratio of the US to Cuba death rate is 4 times. And why is that? Cuba has a robust public health system. International observers have recognized that. Obviously, the United States doesn't. And the defunding of our public health has certainly contributed to this, along with what has already been pointed out, what Robert pointed out, the insidious influence of the anti-vax, anti-mandate propaganda that comes mainly from the far right, not only in the United States, but globally. And by the way, there's a convergence with climate denialism as well. Andreas Malm and his associates wrote a very good book documenting this called White Skin, Black Fuel that I recommend, Verso Press. And so, by the way, the ratio for the US to China death rate by population, 800. The death rate in the United States is 800 times the death rate of China. So I would just conclude, Cuba did this, even though Biden during the campaign said he would want to normalize relations with Cuba like Obama did, but he did the opposite. He basically imposed new sanctions against Cuba. And in spite of that, Cuba has vaccinated virtually all its population and has been sharing it with people all over the world. So let's respect public health and investment in public health, as several of you pointed out.
Oh, you're muted, Nicholas.
Yeah, and are we ready to accept the social regime in China and Cuba? Are we? Are we ready to live under the conditions that the Chinese government imposes on its population? Are you ready? I'm asking you so openly. I mean, you call me names, neoliberal, this and that, but what about freedom? Isn't freedom important to you? I think it is. It's very important to you, I'm sure. It's important to everybody in the panel. So we should really take that more seriously before looking at just the statistics. At least that's my point of view. But I wanted to come back, though, to the issue of inequality, because I think that's a very important issue that was brought up by Jennifer, the issue of inequality, and especially, maybe somebody else said that too, that the rich got richer during the pandemic. I actually think inequality is a result of the fourth industrial revolution that we have been living in for a long time, actually, and now we see the big fruits of it. Because that industrial revolution meant that we use more machines, we use more software, we use more robots, and because they have become more productive over time. And the way that things work in a corporation or in any business, this productivity is attributed to capital and not to labor. And it's therefore paid to capital. And therefore, it shows up in profits. So if a laborer is changed and replaced by a machine, then the amount that goes to labor decreases and the amount that goes to capital and profits increases. So that almost automatically creates inequality. It's inequality at the corporate level, at the level of the business. But if you think that the owners of the capital are not the workers, then automatically it creates an inequality between the owners of the capital and the workers. And that's something that is there. I mean, we should really see it for sure that way. And at least in my opinion, the way to fix it is to make sure that the workers have a part of the business. They have shares. They have a way to get to have an avenue of access to the profits of the corporation. It won't fix inequality across the board, but it will fix this particular inequality to some extent that comes from the fourth industrial revolution. It comes from the importance of the increase in the productivity of machines and software. And I think that we should take it, at least from my point of view, we should think of ways for this to actually happen, which we might be able to implement at the corporate level and fix a significant part of this inequality.
I think one of the objections that you hear most often when there's any proposal to do anything to reduce inequality is that you don't want to kill the geese who lay the golden eggs. It's the people at the top who are doing the real work in the economy. And if we were to tax them more heavily, they would either not try as hard as they're trying now, or if it were in a local jurisdiction, we tried that, then they would move somewhere else. That's been actually put to the test many times. I think in the most vivid recent experiment in California, the legislature there raised the top marginal tax rate from 9% to 13.5%. That's a 50% increase. It came in two bursts, not far apart. And the predictions were dire. The predictions were uniform that the movers and the shakers, the people that made California the wealthiest state in the country, were going to move to Oregon. They were going to move to Nevada. They were going to flee the state in droves. It's been studied now. Stanford published a very detailed study in the wake of those increases. They tracked every percentile in the income distribution among California residents, the 99th percentile, the people who are wealthier than 99% of the state's residents, left the state at the lowest rate by far of any other spot on the income ladder. So, people have lives. They're thriving in their local areas. The state's in budget surplus now. The state university system, which Nick, was the best in the world from your own experience there. It was in crisis. It's no longer in crisis. It's now being much better funded. The roads are better repaired now. Things are still struggling in some ways in California, but I think the revenue from those hikes has enabled people to lead better lives on balance. They, as you say, they weren't going to spend it all anyway, and there's been a lot of public investment with the funds that were raised. So all in all, a good trade. It seems to me.
May I? Yeah, I just wanted to. I see what you're saying, Robert, but my proposal wasn't to tax the rich. My proposal is to find ways in which the workers would get a part of the company. They would get shares, and that's how they would participate in the wealth that was being created. So that's quite different. It's not really changing the taxation system at all. It's just a way to provide wealth to the workers through ownership, partial ownership.
So let me suggest that we urge capital owners to give some of their ownership to the workers, and then imagine that they say, no, we'd rather not do that. And then we counter with a proposal, well, we're going to tax you and buy shares that we'll deposit in an account for them.
Well, one way to do it—
tax the rich.
One way to do it would be to provide incentives to the rich. I see this negative point of view here. Let's tax them. Let's beat them up. Why that? What happened to positive incentives? Is that how we run our corporations? Is this how we run our universities? By beating people up? What if we create them give them incentives?
Well, so incentives.
What the incentives have been. I have a chart. Unfortunately, I can't share it right on the screen. Data from 1948 to 2018. Productivity has increased to 253%. Hourly compensation for workers increased 115%. Okay, where did that gap go? It went to corporations in the top 1%. Okay, so
the other thing I find very funny is you, Nicholas, rightly started off with the crisis of education and the idea that we didn't want to give students things they didn't earn. And as you know, incentives and disincentives are two sides of the same coin. And this is one thing I've really discovered in the work on shame and honor. And to tack on to Bob's point about California, California also has an issue with delinquent taxpayers. And it turns out, of course, that the rich, when they're not paying their income taxes, have a greater effect on the tax deficit than the poor. That's the nature of taxes. And rather than introduce a policy where they decided to expose everyone who hadn't paid their taxes, which felt potentially, well, I guess unjust and also maybe wouldn't use attention in the best way, they introduced a policy where they only shamed the top, they threatened to shame the top 500 tax delinquents in the state. They initially thought they might make the money back on the policy. It costs about $180,000 a year to employ people to manage these lists and to send out the letters and to potentially publish the names online. And they've gotten hundreds of millions of dollars in back taxes through a threat of a disincentive, which is to just expose your name. It's just reputation, and it costs very little. And you ask, well, why disincentives? What happened to the incentive? Well, what, we're going to honor people who pay their taxes? It all depends on the norm, right? We're going to honor people who write the best album of the year or make the best movie of the year. But when you're dealing with not delinquent taxpayers, disincentives are really the only option in the system. There's not an incentive mirror in that kind of social problem.
The thing is, though, no one's given Nicholas an opportunity to express how there might be a positive incentive in the scenario of providing equity to workers. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Sure. I mean, the standard, the way in which the government provides incentives is through taxation. So if for example, it went to Amazon and said, well, we'll tax you a bit less, or for these particular shares that you're going to transfer to workers or potentially transfer to workers, offer them to workers, besides the regular compensation, that could work, right? I mean, that could create an incentive for any corporation to say, look, I mean, from now on, from 2022, we're going to hire people and not just pay them $20 an hour, but we're going to also give them some percentage of the corporation, so they will have in the future some percentage of the profits. You can even give it in a different way, in which you can loan them the shares so they can get some percentage of the profits. There are ways to do these things, but they're not clobbering the rich. This is a way to figure out a way so that self-driven interest of these guys who manage these companies would create a more just society in the future, and through using positive incentives. And I think that's important. I think that's in my experience in life, maybe not yours, but in my experience in life, people respond much more positive, much more easily and positive to positive incentives than the negative incentives.
Let me just jump in one more time. I wondered though, Nicholas, if you think that clobbering the rich isn't a good idea because it's too severe a punishment or it's too negative for them to tolerate, or whether it just provides the public with a negative view of capital.
Well, I mean, I won't go into the sociology kind of issues of why this thing might be bad for psychologically or socially, but I want to say it from only purely economic point of view. If you take $20 billion away from Bezos, you are not taking it away from his consumption, right? You're not restricting them from buying a great house or a great yacht or whatever. You are taking it away from investment. Okay, that money was going to investment, and now it's going to the government. And we will see if the government actually invests it, or let's say invests 30% of it and gives away to the voters the remaining part. So that's important, because that says that we are changing the investment to consumption ratio in the country, and we need investment. That's why I said you should be careful about taking away this money, because the way politicians have presented it, it's as if it's just free. There is no bad consequences of it. I mean, how can it be bad to take $20 billion from Bezos? And I have nothing to do with Bezos and Amazon, by the way. Just I'm not in any way concerned. But how can it be bad? People don't even think about it, but it has significant negative consequences, at least in my opinion. So we can think of other ways in which we can, if we need money to finance ourselves, I mean, can create more investment, we can think about it. In my opinion, it would make more sense to give money to the private sector to do investments rather than the public sector, because traditionally the public sector doesn't produce as good results as the private sector. And I think that is in general understood in the United States. I mean, we don't see the United States try to make its own fighter planes. They don't. They just try to give the contracts to the private sector, and in many other dimensions. So I don't know. In other countries, yeah, it's possible. In Cuba, things happen differently. It's possible in China, things happen differently. It's possible in Russia, things happen differently, but not in the United States. So, given the environment we live in, we should think of ways to tweak it in the right direction rather than in the wrong direction.
I mean, my students are usually shocked when I tell them that in the 1970s, the top marginal tax rate was 70%. And somehow that didn't prevent the economy from being productive and efficient, and it didn't forestall growth. And I look at Build Back Better, which is now stalled in the Senate. And Build Back Better isn't about massive tax increases. It's about spending maybe 1 or 2% of national income to address some critical problems relating to education and social justice and also decarbonization. And markets aren't going to get those jobs done aren't working on their own. Market failures have caused those problems. And a maldistribution of wealth has contributed to those problems, including also, I look at public schools, and I'm very concerned about the inequality that we see in education between, people in privileged communities like the town that I live in Hanover, New Hampshire. And then I look at poor Black and brown communities suffering because they don't have good schools and they don't have good public services. And we need to invest in those people, not just for the sake of those communities, not just for the sake of social justice, but also because that's human capital, and that's where our nation's future lies.
Richard, you could mention also that in Build Back Better, the final version that was, blocked by 2 senators, it also, they gutted out provision to tax the rich because of a few, Wall Street inclined Democrats that got that removed. And not only, remember, under Eisenhower, the top marginal rate was over 90%.
That's true.
Yeah. And matter of fact, the latest issue of The Nation has a proposal to bring that marginal rate back. Nevertheless, even with that marginal rate, and I've looked into tax issues in DC, but even with that high marginal rate, the effective tax rate that the very wealthy were paying was like 40%, because of loopholes and so on. We need to address that. But my question to Nicholas is, why should we trust the billionaires that own these companies to make the right decisions about investment? Where should it go? Why shouldn't that decision be socially determined rather than by billionaires? And I would take a lesson from the movie Don't Look Up. Okay, to me, as a climate scientist, that message was that obviously it was about the threat of climate catastrophe, not really about an asteroid. And secondly, the message was, if we trust the billionaire solution, we'll be doomed. That was, if you watch the movie, that's what it ended up. And I think that was a very good prescription about what we should do, actually, because I believe the world is overpopulated. Even 1 billionaire is one too many.
I wondered, because just before Nicholas takes a shot at that, I mean, the term,
I would hope that get a response.
the term neoliberal was used earlier, and I wondered if anyone wants to offer a kind of a definition of what that means, and maybe, yeah.
What what we tell our students is that it means a transition from more public provisioning and a public, having a mixed economy with the government and markets. And it means the focus on market liberalization and then a transfer also of political power from the people, from the public, from the public to an entanglement between corporate interests and then political interests. Now that's contentious. I teach in a department where I'm an economist, but my colleagues are human geographers. And I think what I just said is roughly what they would say.
I was wondering
if you want me to reply, I don't want to reply about the names. People call names curses all the time. I'm not going to get pigeonholed to a particular name. I'm telling you my positions. I'm telling you, I'm trying to argue seriously about what I think needs to be done. If you want to argue seriously too, you can find a way to talk about the reasons why this is not right or this is right. Just saying, oh, we have too many billionaires, let's execute them and so on. That's just childish. Come on. Seriously, we need you. I think that there is a serious issue, very serious, and we have opened at least 3 or 4 that we need to argue on, to talk about them. I don't think that characterizations make any difference, in my opinion. I don't want to talk about them.
I think it would be useful, though, to not view proposals to raise the progressivity of the tax system as somehow a moral indictment of the rich or a statement that we're out to get them. My effective tax rate, I learned from my accountant, is over 30%. Jeff Bezos pays next to nothing in tax. I think when he thinks about investment, if he were taxed more heavily, the way we teach investment is that if the rate of return on an investment is 6% and you can borrow money at 5%, then you ought to do it. You invest if the rate of return is greater than your cost of capital. We don't in any part of that module teach them, look at your wealth balance and decide whether to invest. Maybe that would influence your attitude toward risk, but I can't imagine that's going to be a factor for Bezos. So taxing his wealth will not change the projects he finds it profitable to invest in. That's just not one of the things that's on the table. Maybe if he had a little less wealth, he wouldn't be as quick to spend money on a rocket ship to take a thrill ride into space. That's possible. It's easier for me to imagine that response than that he would back away from an otherwise profitable investment.
But let's go back to the issue. What am I saying? Why am I saying that he will invest less? Because the government will take away this money, okay, for sure. And that's the money that are being presently invested in whatever way. I'm not even going to argue that they're ordered, that he's investing them in the right way. But he's invested somewhere. Maybe it's invested in whatever activities Amazon does, okay? So this money is invested. Now the government is going to take it. But the government has mixed incentives. I said it before. The government, is run by politicians who want to be reelected, and that creates an incentive not to invest whatever 20 billion they got from Bezos, okay, but to use a significant part of it in giving it to the voters, giving it to the people who are going to get you reelected. Or in your theories, some of you said, or giving it to the corporations that will get you reelected. You said it, not me, okay? But either way, the incentives are not okay anymore. The money is taken away from the US economy and is given to consumption, or some significant part of it given to consumption. And that's a bad idea.
I would say that with Build Back Better, a lot of the investment is in kids, and it's in here and it's in schools, and those are investments in human capital, and human capital is a productive asset that we need more of.
And those are investments that have high returns. We know that they have really high returns.
The other thing that, to bring it back to climate change, I think, is to to think a little bit about the investments that have been made over the last 3 or 4 decades in renewable energy. And one thing that is upsetting to me is that the people analyzing what, sort of what this effect has had on the economy and certainly on the energy system and on the climate system are sociologists, not economists. They don't seem compelled to dig into these data, but the data show, of course, that it is not a one-to-one substitution. That in fact there's more fossil fuel being used. This is in some ways complementary and not a substitute to the existing fossil fuel use, which suggests that the economic theory that you build it, they will come, it will substitute, whether or not it's, and we see this across so many other products too, right? In aquaculture, something else I study, it's been complementary to capture fisheries. It has not been a substitution for it. Renewable energy and fossil fuels, and it's sort of endless the way in which, again, the foundational economic theory has been undermined by the empirics. But it speaks again to this idea of incentives versus disincentives, and the point I brought up very early in the conversation about divestment, that investment sometimes has to be coupled with divestment, and divestment being a voyage as well to a kind of stigmatization of fossil fuels, not just an economic lever, and understanding there's a reputation even to the product itself. And it's something, again, that I feel economists do not want to engage on. They want to talk about the market. They don't want to talk about the reputation even of the product, even though they're perfectly willing to talk about the reputation of brands, as you know, Bob.
We're gonna soon, open up, and I'm not cutting the conversation off yet, but I wanted to ask, in any kind of negotiation, when there's different viewpoints and parties, there's this first effort to say, well, what do we share in common? Like, what can we all agree would be reasonable? And I have to think that, given the way the conversation has gone, the question might be posed, what are the things that via incentives, the government, which will come from the government should be involved in trying to affect the economy? What are legitimate goals that the government can get involved with incentives, whether or not they're taxes or they're subsidies or whatever they may be?
Following up on what Jerry said, I think it will be good if we could move also a little bit and look at the future, what you see happening and what you think is possible to happen as we look at the future and the next 10, 20 years in terms of climate change and so on.
Let me add a couple of cents on that one, because I think we need to not only promote a Green New Deal in the US, but a global Green New Deal. And there have been many proposals out there. I think Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal was probably the best that's been put out in the, mainstream. And because it also includes a cut in the military budget, a rather modest cut in the military budget. But that was a robust Green New Deal that would really have an impact on what Jennifer's referring to curb fossil fuel consumption while renewable energy is being built robustly. And of course, the global South needs the most investment there in terms of renewable energy, which is related to the energy, the fact that most of humanity suffers from energy poverty, okay, which is because most people in the world don't have enough energy consumption in their nation to live to the highest life expectancy. You can find out more in our book, The Earth is Not for Sale, on that issue. But the global Green New Deal, for it to be a success, will require demilitarization of the global economy, because that's another area where we have huge waste of $2 trillion a year in expenditures. So in addition to the 5-6 trillion going to fossil fuel subsidies, direct and indirect, we have that too. And so that would be what I see as the hope for any chance of meeting the 1.5 degree warming limit of the IPCC and creating a better life for everyone in the world at the same time. So that will be my final intervention.
Can I say something about a point that Jacqueline made? I think some economists are sympathetic to what you do. Certainly, the message of much of what you've written about, I take to be this, which is that public policy levers that we have, the traditional ones that we've been talking about for the 2 centuries that there's even been a field called economics, are actually much, much more powerful than we even imagined them to be. And I think the example that really drive that point home for me was the taxes we started imposing on smoking. We didn't do that really at any significant degree until we saw studies coming out of Japan showing that secondhand smoke exposure caused illnesses in others. Those links are actually fairly weak. You don't harm others very much with your secondhand smoke. But that was the excuse we felt we needed to start discouraging people from smoking. We didn't want to say, we want to protect you from yourself. We want to say, it's legitimate to tax you because you're harming others. It turns out that the real harm you cause to others when you smoke is not from your secondhand smoke, it's by making others in your circle more likely to smoke. We take our cues to a much greater degree than I think most of us realize by what people around us do. I started smoking when I was 14 because most of my friends smoked. I'm grateful to have quit a few years later. Most people don't manage to quit. They're stuck for the rest of their lives. And a friend who had been a smoker and also a heroin user told me that it was much harder for him to quit smoking than it was for him to quit heroin. So it's perhaps the most addictive substance we know of. And the reason the taxes worked, they didn't work very well at first. If you're a smoker, you're going to keep on smoking. You'll just buy less of something else when they tax your cigarettes. The reason it worked is that some people quit and others didn't start. Maybe the ones with the least money in the first place didn't start. That meant each and every peer group had fewer smokers in it. That meant everyone else in those groups were less likely to start or remain smoking. And over time, there's just no other way to account for how we went from a smoking rate among adults of over half to what it is today, 13%. Nobody says, oh, that's horrible, we shouldn't have done that. Everybody says, thank goodness we took that step. And there are steps like that to be taken in domain after domain, many of them in the climate. We could change energy use patterns in a dramatic way just by some gentle shifting of incentives and let people influence one another to carry the ball the rest of the way home.
Jennifer, Richard, Nick? Any
Well,
last
you asked if
thoughts?
there are things we agree on. I agree strongly in incentives. And I think it's important though, it's Elizabeth Warren that says that she believes in markets with rules. And I think what I would say is that many of the problems that we have to do with having written rules that were pursued by rent seekers that have facilitated rent capture at the expense of investment and innovation. And so I'm not anti-billionaire, I'm not anti-market. I think we need to work on making markets work more efficiently and making our economy more innovative again. And that means balancing. I mean, some of the most important investments clearly have to be done by the public sector because they're public goods.
Yeah, I would say that it will be very useful to create positive incentives to reduce consumption. And different types of consumption of energy at home, consumption of energy in the cars, and so on. And additionally, at least in my opinion, it's important for whatever major investment is going to happen in production, to also give incentives to individuals and companies to go in that direction. I don't think I can agree with the idea that the major investment should happen by the government. As I said before, the government has terrible results in terms of productivity compared to the public sector, and we shouldn't really go with major investments in that direction if we can actually do them in the private sector by tweaking the incentives. So at least that's my approach. I'm not saying that there are areas in which the public, the government shouldn't be involved. I'm saying that the lion's shares of the investment should be geared towards the private sector doing them, and we can fix the right incentives. And I don't think we have disagreements among ourselves that there is a way to fix incentives so that money pours in the direction we want them to pour.
Yeah, I agree with that in part. And I'll just say, schools are an investment. I think hospitals and I think healthcare is an investment, and we spend 17% of U.S. national income on the healthcare sector, and that's about twice as much as other industrialized countries, and we have worse life expectancy. And that's an example where we're spending more than we should be to get an outcome that we don't like very much. And that's the product of a whole bunch of misaligned incentives that were structured to facilitate rent capture. So I would focus hard on getting the rent capture and monopoly power out of the economy. I think and that would help with the political problems that we have.
And I think another thing that would help is really to challenge what economists tell us are the variables that we have to pay attention to. We have to pay attention to parts per million. We have to pay attention to the extinction rates of species. We have to pay attention to flourishing, as Bob said. These are not captured by productivity or GDP or return on investment or any of these variables that economists want to constantly bring us back to as the fundamentals to the economy. And that is why I think it's hard to be someone like Rich, where you are an economist with broad sweeping values, because you're kind of stuck. And it's why I left economics to go to a Department of Environmental Studies, where I felt like I could set the terms of the kind of future I wanted without being hemmed into the ideology, which is not a science, of the foundations of economics.
Yeah, I'll accept that, but I'll say that I'm professor of environmental studies, and my work is at the interfaces between economics, governance, political ecology, the environmental sciences. And so I'm sitting in a very interdisciplinary space and trying to figure out how this discipline of economics we need to get that part of that right.
All right. Hold on, everybody. We're not over. Hold on, Nicholas, please hold on.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that on this issue of what economists pays attention to, I mean, I think that economics is a pretty wide set of tools. And if there was a way, and if there is a way to take into account all the stuff that Jennifer says, some young assistant professor would write a great paper and get it published and get tenured based on that. So I don't think that it's you should preclude the idea that in a whole field as wide as this, as economics is, with a collection of tools and then using some assumptions and getting certain conclusions, that somehow the majority of economists oppresses the rest of the economists, so they cannot really write something really interesting in that dimension. I mean, I cannot believe that. I mean, I've seen people in my lifetime in the economics world write some very radical stuff and get tenured based on that. So it's not. I wouldn't agree that we are, that not so open as it's being presented.
All right, so
I just want to add that I'm not talking about getting tenure. I'm talking about controlling the public conversation. I'm talking about being in the White House. I'm talking about having power. And those people can get tenure, but they have not been the right-hand man for the president.
Look, I mean, economists don't run the world. That's for sure. I mean, they like Harry Truman said, economists come to me and say, on the one hand this, and on the other hand this. That's why I hate economists. The politicians run the world, not us. Okay, so if you want to make political change, you can make political change, but it's not up to the economists to make the political change. I think it's up to you and me as citizens to make the political.
All right. So now I do want to step in here finally. This is wonderful. I think actually this conversation. We have some questions I know from our viewing audience, and Alex will sign in here and give us some of those questions that you could all take a shot at responding to.
Yeah, so I guess to everyone watching on Zoom and on YouTube, please write your questions in the respective spots, and I'll get to them. So let's click. Okay. Let's see. I'll start with Risa Mandel wrote this really early on. And so they wrote, I guess, thank you for the question, Risa. They wrote, does innovation have to implicate growth, which they believe is a fetish and driver of ecological degradation?
I'm sorry.
I'll take a quick. Go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify the questions. Is innovation?
I guess, yeah, does innovation have to implicate growth? I guess, like, do
they have to imply growth?
Or involve it, or
yeah, you could have very innovative energy policies that decarbonize the economy. But I will say one thing is that having been trained as an energy economist, we knew in the early 1980s or the early 1990s that we could decarbonize the economy by paying about 1 or 2% of GDP for some decades, and that wouldn't have very much impact on the rate of growth. And so this idea that growth and environmental conservation are incompatible, I don't think that works empirically. I mean, there are people that do think that works empirically, but in 1 or 2% of GDP, you don't pay that unless you're going to get a return on that investment in climate capital. So that's not those resources are real, but I don't think there's a trade-off really between growth and the environment. I think they go hand in hand. And actually, to say one more thing, the US spends about 3% of national income on environmental compliance, mostly because of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. And the benefits to society are much greater than 3%.
Yeah, I'd go one step further, Richard. There are a lot of people in the environmental movement who say we've got to somehow accept the idea that growth is a bad thing, and that we've got to be prepared to live without growth. I think that's wrongheaded because it's growth in certain kinds of things that are harmful. There are lots of things that we can have more of with not only no harm to anyone else, but with benefits. You know, if we plant ornamental trees around our house, that doesn't harm the environment. It gives pleasure to neighbors walking by. I mean, my wife takes piano lessons. There's no environmental harm from that. There's all sorts of things that we spend our income on that don't cause any harm to anyone else and often create external benefits for other people. And what we know, and there's good work on this, is that when we don't grow, when the economy grows slowly, we're much less likely to make important public investments. We're much less likely to take steps to increase social justice of various kinds. We start reining in and becoming much more stingy in the public sphere when there's a low growth rate. So I think growth is a positive
point. To your point, Robert, that the GDP or GNP has been critiqued by degrowthers, and I shared on the chat my critique of degrowth because it doesn't this GDP, as many have already written about, for the common good, Daly and Cobb, that you need to look at what the components of growth are, as you just pointed out. So there's bad growth and good growth. I would submit that the growth of the military-industrial complex and the defense budget is bad growth. The growth of renewable energy and affordable housing and ecological agriculture would be good growth. So we need to deconstruct what the growth is. And therefore, I recognize the contribution of the degrowth discourse that has positive implications, but many of them fail to do this deconstruction of what growth is. And so that's my 2 cents.
Next question.
Okay. Risa, I think wanted to hear Nicholas's viewpoint, given I guess the perceived perspective that he's a neoliberal. So apologies, but if he wants anything to add to that, just in case. If not, we could go on to the next question. If there wasn't anything that wasn't said that he wants to add, if not, it's okay. Go on to the next question. I was just noting what Risa wanted to say was directed towards Nick.
Yeah, I would say it's best not to try to pigeonhole people and just argue on the specifics of the arguments. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to talk about them.
Okay, okay.
Oh, you were muted, Alex.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. All right. Next we have Linda Martin. Thank you, Linda. Linda wrote, what fact do you know about narcissism and how do you think it impacts income inequality, capitalism, government? Are you familiar with research that has been done on the destructive impact of narcissists on corporations? And then they also add on even your own fields or the impact on business or government in general.
I'm concerned that in America that we've landed on a blame culture, and we like to attribute problems in society to someone else, our outgroup, rather than looking at what we ourselves in our in-group can do to affect positive change. And I'm not sure if that's narcissistic, but I mean there's a difference between taking ownership and responsibility and this game of outgroup politics, which I think is very corrosive. I'm not sure if is that a non sequitur? I mean, it's to me that's related to narcissism in a way.
The only paper, I'm sure, Bob, you've read more, but because you study luxury markets, but on narcissism, I read took Murray Gell-Mann, the physicist, as its prime example. So I don't feel comfortable representing those views completely because they were very unfamiliar to me.
I mean, to the extent that you associate narcissism with luxury consumption, then the main consequence of it is that it's simply wasteful. That if you need a diamond 3 times as big to express a given level of commitment, that's not really doing anybody any good compared to a regime when all were spending less and express the same amount of commitment as before.
Alex, next question.
Okay. Next one. This is from Mel M. Thank you, Mel. They wrote, what are the chances of Ray Dalio's worry that inequality between the wealthy and the poor could lead to a bloody revolution? Is the current rise in populism on the left and the right a sign this has already started?
I'm going to obliquely say that I think that our political divide in the United States is at least in part a class divide. And that healing the class divide, I think, is going to require fresh thinking and some kind of realignment. And I would like to, I mean, this is a political statement, but I would like to see the Democrats think a little more about the demos and about creating an inclusive, an America that's inclusive of all people. And that probably means focusing on rebuilding the working and middle class.
Interesting. That was exactly Bernie Sanders' advice in an interview on The Guardian. So he made the same point.
I do read the Guardian, but yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask that question? I mean, why do you think that the political divide is a class divide when we see some of the wealthiest people in the United States supporting very left-wing points of view?
Well, what they support that's left wing are cultural values. It's not about how we organize the economy. And so we shifted from a debate over economics and class to a coded debate that's about quote unquote traditional values versus, what term should I use here? I mean, the other side of the culture wars. And I don't want to put a label on that, because labels we need to be very careful about, as you said. But I do think that it's become, it's also about not just income, but it's about education. And so what really marks this class divide is about educational status or educational attainment. That's at least partly what I read in The Guardian and other places.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, when in the general statement about political divide being a class divide, we have seen Bill Gates, Warren Buffett come out and say, we really want to be taxed more.
Yeah.
Okay, right. I mean, and these are some of the wealthiest people in the United States, correct? Yes. So
that's fair. I'm not calling for a class war. I mean, but I do think that we need an economy that's more inclusive. And I look at the Rust Belt from Milwaukee all the way over to Rochester, New York, maybe even to Troy, New York, and I see a part of the country that has just struggled for the last 40 years since the Paul Volcker interest rate hike, and then when manufacturing went downhill. And for that part of the country to do better, it seems that we need some form of regional economic development and industrial policy. And I'm not an expert on that, but I'm inclined to think that would help our politics.
I am adding to the chat a great book on that I read last year on billionaires and stealth politics, because part of this also is about reputation. So Bill Gates gets a lot of attention for that. Soros gets a lot of attention. But the vast majority of billionaire wealth actually is going to support Republican candidates. And this was a great empirical treatise on that point.
Alex, you want to read the next question?
Yes, I'll go on to the next one. I'm trying to make sure I got everyone. There was one in the chat. Okay. So let's see. I have two more for now. So this one's from Gregory Burke from YouTube. They wrote, why do we obsess about GDP when it does not include health, education, nor general well-being?
I think it was a point Jennifer made a little bit earlier. You started to talk to that.
Okay, is there
Can I
anything
ask
more you
a
want to add?
question?
Sorry.
How can we get the chat record? Because can you give us a copy of the chat? Because there's some very interesting posts there, like Jennifer's post. And
no, I'm collecting the URLs, and I could post it as a comment
great.
on the
Thank
website later, so I could do that. Yes. So is there anything more you'd like to add to that? I could go on to the next question if you feel it's been.
Well, just so what matters is well-being, and then the production of market goods and services plus government services. I mean, we measure that, we call that GDP, but there are other things that contribute importantly to GDP. And we also know that in affluent countries that GDP growth doesn't really increase average well-being very much. And so we should stop using GDP as a metric of the good society. But what I would agree though with Amartya Sen, and probably with Nicholas, that economic growth is a means if we use the means of growth to support the right ends.
Maybe Bob wants to talk about Nepal's view of GDP, gross national happiness.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually Bhutan that has taken
the
the lead
Bhutan
on that. They have what they call the Gross National Happiness Index, and they measure their progress according to movements in it rather than movements in GDP. And I think there's a case to be made for that. Certainly, focusing only on the dollar value of the stuff we can buy leaves out a whole laundry list of things we know we care about. And so, I mean, even just counting the fact that we're depleting resources to produce this GDP, we don't take any account of that, which seems like an odd thing to leave out. If you burn up billions of dollars of resources producing an annual GDP that's barely more than that, you're not really adding much to the picture if you're doing that. And there's a long list of things that we know that matter to people's well-being that aren't included at all in GDP. I mean, if you have time to do exercise every day, that makes people happier and healthier. There's good evidence on that. If people had 6 weeks of vacation a year instead of 1 or 2 weeks, they would be happier and healthier. There are hard data on that. So the fact is, we don't measure those things. We could measure them, and we ought to. We would be more likely to pay attention to them if we measured.
Well, and I'll just put in a plug.
Let me
put in a
just
plug
say,
for 2 things.
yeah, go ahead.
One is the book with Sen and Stiglitz and Tusi that was the report to the French government.
Yes.
And that's outstanding, and that's 2 Nobel laureate economists. And so if we think that mainstream economics is all of one voice about GDP, then that's an exception. And I'm also an admirer of Kate Raworth's concept of the donut economy, which has the planetary boundaries and living within planetary limits, but also the social floor, which means meeting people's basic needs and focusing on human flourishing or thriving rather than the opulence per se as the goal.
On the point of the happiness index, it should be, I actually discussed this in my last book, The Global Solar Commons, and the people of Bhutan don't live really that long, actually. So people can be happy with the assumed constraints, which may be unconscious of their society. You can, you could be happy. Oh, well, I'm not gonna, my parents didn't live more than 70 years, so that's my expectation. And you can be happy under those conditions. So I think there's limits to the happiness index if you want to apply this globally, to what is really possible for quality of life of people in the world. I wouldn't go by the happiness index.
Or certainly not only by it.
Alex, I think we have to think about wrapping up. Is there one more question we want to pose?
Yeah, I think sorry, it was lost in the chat. Well, okay, so I mean, there's a few people talking about stock buybacks. We had Mel M again, and then also Anthony Lobier. They're talking about stock buybacks. So I guess, is there any comments anyone wants to make related to like incentives to discourage stock buybacks, or like what role stock buybacks could play, I guess, in a relatively ethical manner or a moral manner that fits in line with what everyone's been talking about today? Because that seems to be what people are sort of grasping at in their comments about stock buybacks.
I mean, maybe I'll say something about stock buybacks. First of all, I don't see it as a crucial issue, but I would be concerned as an economist about companies that are doing widespread stock buybacks, because essentially what they're saying is that we don't want to give this money as dividends to shareholders, but we want to just invest in ourselves more. I mean, I'm not sure that's the best strategy, but at the same time, I don't really see this as a big deal. I mean, this is we talked about a whole bunch of other problems today. I don't think that's a crucial one.
As we are coming to ending, I just want everybody to know that if they want to go on our website, there may be more comments, and if you want to respond to them on the website, you're welcome.
Great. All right, well, look, I want to really, Alex?
Would I be able to ask one question, or if you want to close out, I'm fine with that too. I don't want to.
Go ahead.
Anyway, oh yeah. So I guess going back to the definition of neoliberalism, it seems more oriented towards the market liberalization side. But do you think that overlooks that government spending has gone up a lot in a bipartisan manner since about Reagan? Given the fact that usually when people talk about neoliberalism, they talk about sort of the change in economic policy from Reagan and Thatcher on. Because I mean, I'm looking, the U.S. on a per capita basis does spend more on health insurance and education compared to in the OECD index. So, like, do you think if we, like, in the critiques of neoliberalism by mostly saying it's supply side, we tend to overlook some of the more Keynesian issues that have come with neoliberalism? Because when I hear rent sinking behavior and the crony capitalistic complaints people make, that seems to be more of an issue of the where, like, the points where government and private industry mix together. So yeah, what do you have to say about those comments?
On the question of our spending more on health insurance, it's true, we spend twice what the OECD countries spend on health insurance, and we get way worse outcomes. And you can hold, I think, a variety of discussable views about whether government is more efficient or the private sector is more efficient. But I think there are certain structures of markets under which we know that pure private market incentives lead to bad outcomes. And I think health markets are exactly a case in point of that. The adverse selection problem, you know, people hated the mandate in the Obamacare bill. They were all in favor of the idea that we require insurance companies to sell us insurance at affordable rates, even if we had pre-existing conditions, but they hated the mandate. And I could never have a conversation that went anywhere with those people until, quite by accident, one day I asked the question, what do you think would happen if the government required home insurance companies to sell fire insurance at affordable rates to people after their houses had already burned down? And thinking about that question, everybody got it right away. Well, the insurance companies would go bankrupt, of course. Well, the health insurance companies go bankrupt if they have to sell health insurance at affordable rates. Even if you have a pre-existing condition, that's the guy whose house is already burned down. They can't insure you unless everybody's in the pool. Every other government just puts everybody in the pool, and they don't argue about it. That, you know, it's paid for out of tax revenues. You're insured, you're covered. We don't do that here. We've taken a small step toward doing it, but the history of how we've done it in the past, under relying strictly on private incentives, thinking that the private sector is always more efficient, just has led us to this absolutely horrible outcome.
And relying on employer paid insurance can be a burden on working people because of the very high benefits costs, which gives companies an incentive not to hire working and middle class employees. That might be one of the reasons.
And you can't leave your job if that's how you get your insurance.
And that does not feel like freedom.
Yeah, well, that's freedom to die sooner than our cohorts, wealthier cohorts that provide, guaranteed health insurance for everyone.
I think
ranking 40th in the world in life expectancy now in the United States.
But I think on the issues of the health system, there are very, very serious issues of monopolization of certain sectors. And I would also say that I think that there are very serious issues of monopolization in the provision of broadband, for example. We pay much more on broadband than people pay, let's say, in France. And these are very serious issues. And unfortunately, we didn't talk about them in most of our talk today because we couldn't possibly talk about everything. There are issues. And Alex, in terms of the question that's being asked, that it's very important to also, to a significant extent, beef up the antitrust enforcement in the United States so that we deal with the monopolization issues. Now, of course, on the issue of insurance, Robert is absolutely right. There is the problem of adverse selection and has to be dealt with very specifically on that. But anyway, I wanted to end at a good note. I appreciate being invited and talk about with everybody, and I am humbled by all the good opinions that I hear today, and I thank you very much.
Well,
thank you, everybody.
That was wonderful.
A challenge for us. We appreciate that.
Well, on that
Otherwise
very
Otherwise, it would be
Go
boring.
on.
yeah, on
Thank
that
you,
very
everybody.
on that very undismal note, I want to thank everybody for a wonderful and very lively conversation today, and look forward to having a reason to be in touch with you again in the future sometime.
Thank you,
so
Jim.
much.
Yeah.
Okay, ciao, bye bye.